Well, good morning. Thank you all for being here today. My name's Bill Connors, and very happy to have you at this session today. It's 9:45 here in D.C., right? Okay, well, it's 6:45 in San Francisco, where I'm from. And when I was trying to go to sleep at 11 o'clock last night, I decided that I'm going to ask the session planners if we could do an 11 o'clock session, 11 p.m. session that I get assigned to, because one, I'm from the West Coast, and two, I'm a night person. So I was ready to give this session at 11 o'clock last night, and I could not go to sleep while I was thinking about all the things I wanted to say. In fact, yesterday evening I sat down with some of my friends from Blackbaud, and we were talking about things, and they really got me worked up. And I don't normally start sessions this way, but I'm fortunate to live in San Francisco, and we're lucky to have a brand new museum called the California Academy of Sciences. Some of you may have heard of it. It's actually not new. It's quite old, but in the '89 earthquake, the building was very badly damaged, and so they had to completely rebuild the museum pretty much from the ground up. And it just opened about a year ago. And I've worked with them as a consultant on the Razor's Edge, and I get there before the crowds get there, and I go in the back door and work in the back offices. But at lunch, I always like to eat in the cafeteria. And as I kind of leave the back way into the main area of the museum, I always check out the white alligator to see how the white alligator is doing. And then I work my way past the rainforest on into the cafeteria. And it always strikes me, I love seeing the kids. And not just the kids, but the kids and their families, or the kids in the school groups. And, call it what you may, call it corny or whatever, but I'm always really moved and impressed to see the kids in the museum enjoying and learning and experiencing the planetarium and the aquarium and the rainforest that's there. I also recently had a friend visit from Germany. He's a really good friend, and we went down to the Stanford campus, and I did a tour. We did a tour together of the campus. And truly, again, I know this may sound corny, but I just get inspired and excited by the young people on campus. They're learning, they're excited, they want to make their mark on the world. Last night I met folks from the Canadian Breast Cancer Organization, and my mother is a breast cancer survivor, and I know that the tremendous toll that disease took on her. Yesterday, friends from Aid Atlanta. When I moved to San Francisco in 1998, I joined a church where 500 members of that congregation have been lost to AIDS over the years. So my point is, what you guys do is important. And what you do really makes a difference in the world. And I appreciate that. And I appreciate the opportunity to work with you. And what you do as the database people matters in the mission. And I just wanted to say that and acknowledge that, because last night, as I was talking to people from Blackbaud and elsewhere, it just really brought back that what we do matters. And I just wanted to share that with you this morning. I also think it matters in the context of what we're talking about today, because for our organizations to be good organizations and to do the work well and to do the work efficiently, I think most of us work for our organizations because we care about them. I mean, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand if you don't really care about the organization you work for, because I'm going to assume that most of you do. And I think the topic today is about what's best for our organization, not necessarily what's best for us. We were just talking about the book a minute ago. You might think, well, yeah, he wrote a book. He likes to write. This policy and procedure documentation stuff, that's easy for him because he likes to do it. I promise you, I do not like to write policy and procedure documentation. I just want to write the query and get on with it. I just want to write the report and get on with it. I don't want to have to sit and write the process down. But I know that if I just write the query or just write the report and then go on my merry way, that the organization is not going to be able to continue the process, to understand the process, to repeat the process, to get it out in a correct, accurate way. And that's really what we're here to talk about today, is not just how to do policies and procedures, but how to empower and make our organizations better organizations so that they're not dependent on us as individuals, but that we're empowering and leaving our organization with the resources they need to continue the work and to do the job that they do. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's what we're here to talk about today is policies and procedures. Here's the agenda for today, for this hour-long session. I do want to warn you that I do have a particular passion about policies and procedures. Now, I know that's geeky. I fully admit that that's really geeky to have a passion about policies and procedures. But I'd like for you to pretend there's a box up here, and on the front of that box there's the word soap, and I'm now standing on top of this box, okay? This is the soapbox of mine because as a consultant, I worked for Junior Achievement. Everyone heard of Junior Achievement? Great organization. We bought 200 copies of the Razor's Edge in 1995, and I got to work on that project. I worked for Blackbaud for 7 years, and now I'm a consultant. And I work with organizations time after time after time where no one knows what was done, why it was done. I call it playing RECSI. Okay, where you have to go in and figure out who did what when. And yes, there are dead bodies in the database, okay? And you got to figure out who committed what crime when. And it shouldn't be that way, okay? You should be able to go in and say, if I won the lottery tomorrow, let's say I won $100 million, and I have to figure out now what I'm going to do with my $100 million, so I'm going to leave $100,000 of it to the organization to bring in a professional replacement to do what I do. Would that person know what I do? Would they have the resource to generate the newsletters, the event mailings, the fundraising reports that the organization needs to continue to operate? I think that's important. And so I do have a particular soapbox about this. I do have strong feelings, and so I'm going to warn you about that in advance. So what we're going to talk about are some resources that are available to you so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. We're going to talk about what I think are the purposes and audiences of good policy and procedure documentation for the Razor's Edge. We're going to talk about some common mistakes that I see folks make that I hope you can avoid making after seeing this presentation. I'm going to talk about less good examples. I don't want to use the B word, so we're going to call them less good examples. And then we're going to talk about some good examples. Give you some recommendations, give you an actual outline of what I think the session, what the organization of your documentation should look like, and then I'll give you some more tips and tricks. So that's the content. Now, it is a 60-minute session, so we are going to be limited on the questions and answers that we can take. I apologize for that. I do want to encourage a little bit of discussion, and I did bring the Ghirardelli chocolate squares. We're now in a small enough room where I feel comfortable tossing them. I disclaim all liability, so just be careful and duck when I throw them. I'm in technology, not sports. So a quick question, and then we'll get started. These slides are available on Conference Central right now, and these are exactly the same slides that I'm going to do this morning that were posted online. Okay, there are also 2 other PDF documents that support this that I'll make brief reference to that are 4- and 5-page examples of real live policy and procedure documentation that I created for the Make-A-Wish Foundation in San Francisco, where I've had a 5-year ongoing relationship. So all of this is available on Conference Central. Okay, thank you. Okay, Duck. Thanks for asking. All right, so let's get started. The first thing I want to say is don't reinvent the wheel. Blackbaud has written literally thousands and thousands of pages of documentation. Here's the constituent data entry guide about how to add a new record to the database. How many of you read the Razor's Edge 7 for beginners? Okay, I've been asked 1,000 times over the years, where's the Razor's Edge for Dummies? This is the Razor's Edge for Dummies. Blackbaud couldn't call it that because, of course, that's a trademark name, but the folks in documentation at Blackbaud did an exceptional job taking the thousands of pages of user guides and condensing it into one document, one guide they call the Razor's Edge 7 for Beginners. It's a great, fun, irreverent, thank you, chocolate to you. It's not irrelevant, it's very relevant. It's irreverent guide to the Razor's Edge just in the dummy style. So I highly recommend you take a look at that, okay? So what I think we should do when we write policy and procedure documentation for the Razor's Edge is not rewrite what Blackbaud has already written. If I've seen once, I've probably seen a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen copies of the constituent data entry guide. Here's how to add a constituent. First, you log into the Razor's Edge. Here's how to log into the Razor's Edge. Then this is the navigation bar down the left side. Here's what the home page is about. Here's what the records page is about. Here are the different types of records. Does that already exist? Yeah, Blackbaud's done a great job already writing that. So we should not be writing documentation to teach new users how the Razor's Edge works. What I think we should be doing is that new users need to be trained, not given a manual to read. Does that sound fair? Whose job is it to do that training? Our job, the DBAs, the database administrators as we typically call it. It's our job to train them. Training workbooks are not the same thing as policy and procedure documentation. And you may need a little bit of training material that you need to develop, but that's not what we're talking about today. Even if you feel like, yeah, you really do need some introduction to Razor's Edge for your organization, please don't write that until we talk about the kind of documentation, until you've written the kind of documentation we're going to talk about today. Here's the key. If anyone's printed these out and you're kind of following along, this is the paragraph I want you to highlight, to underline, to star. We should be writing, in my humble opinion, documentation for the Razor's Edge that explains how our copy of the Razor's Edge is used. Not how the Razor's Edge is used in general, but how our copy has been set up and how it's supposed to be used. Okay? Now, some cheat sheets may be necessary in certain situations, but we should not be rewriting Blackbaud's documentation. Okay, let's give you some examples of where you can find other resources. I'll give you a couple on Conference Central of what I think are good examples, but on the Blackbaud website, in the forums, there is an area of shared client documents, and there's a whole section on policy and procedure documentation. So log into the Blackbaud website, go to the support section, go to the forum section, and there you drill down. There's shared client documents, and there's lots of examples of your peers that have shared their work. Now, again, I want to share my appreciation and my recognition for that hard work that's been done and shared with us, but I want to show you what I think are some, again, less good examples of what I would encourage you to not do as you embark upon this for your organization. So here's an example of what I was just talking about. There on the right side of the screen is, the left side of the screen is the navigation bar, and then there's an explanation of what each of the options in the Razor's Edge does. This one then explains what each of the record types are in the Razor's Edge. Not that it's inaccurate, I'm not implying that at all, not that this is good material, but have we seen this somewhere else? Does this exist already somewhere else? How many of you have all the time in the world, and time is not a challenge in writing policy and procedure documentation? Do I see any hands? No, I don't see a single hand. So it's not that this is bad or wrong, but it's just not where our priority should be since it already exists. Okay, so this is an example. We have the capability of tracking relationships. My concern here is that the procedure should not be what we can do, but what we do at our organization. This is sharp looking. There's a copy of the Open a Constituent button, in essence, from the records page of the Razor's Edge. It's been beautifully cropped, and a nice red arrow has been drawn for it. Here's another screenshot that's been cropped. The circle's been drawn, a nice arrow. I mean, I know exactly what I'm looking at. How long did it take to make the screen look like that? Again, how many people have more time than they know what to do with? Okay. So here's what I think are a few good examples until we get into the material. This is very straightforward. It says, at our organization, the data entry as it affects policy and procedure for addressees and salutations is the person with whom our organization has the more important relationship should be first. If the woman signs the checks, she should be the constituent. If the couple is of equal standing, the man should be the constituent. And I'm not necessarily saying that's right. I worked with a women's school once where the man was always the main constituent. And I thought, well, that's silly. You're a school for girls. You're a school for women. Make the women first. The Razor's Edge doesn't have any gender expectations. Put the women first. You're a girls' school. But there needs to be a policy for the organization. It needs to be stated. Here's specifically not how addressees and salutations work in the Razor's Edge, but what our addressees, our primary addressees and salutations should be. Here's step-by-step instructions, but it assumes that the user has some basic understanding of how to navigate the Razor's Edge. Every step is not meticulously illustrated with screenshots and arrows and circles. Okay? Here's a very simple statement that an appeal needs to be added at the end of every mailing so that the mailing is recorded in the records that received it. There's a simple screenshot, but there's no arrows, there are no circles, there's no cropping. So what are some of the differences here? I'm sorry, here's another good example with just very straightforward. This is an example that's out of the PDF that you have in Conference Central. Okay, so what are some of the differences here that I would emphasize? The first is that there should be less focus on screenshots and more on formatting. Is that what I said? Is that what I meant? There should be less focus on screenshots and formatting, more focus on content. I appreciate a picture can be worth 1,000 words, but drawing that picture can take a lot of time. It should be less finished, more working document. This is not terribly pretty. I don't admit that this is as beautiful as some of the other things that we saw, but I tell you what, it took me a lot less time to write that than it took the person who did all of the great screenshots. It needs to be more specific to the organization. Your policy and procedure documentation should not be transferable from one organization to the next. And it should be more focused on the output. How many of you, and you don't have to raise your hand and put yourself on the spot if you don't want to, but how many of you have started policy and procedure documentation and the first thing you started with was how to add a constituent to the database? Okay? So how many of you then have documentation on how to do the newsletter, how to do reporting, how to generate the event mailing? I mean, that's generally the harder part, is how do we get the data out? What particular settings have we chosen? What particular tools have we used? That's what I would suggest needs to be documented every bit as much as just how to add a new constituent to the database. So let's continue to talk about this. What are some other more common mistakes? That the constituent data entry guide is being rewritten. That there's too much focus on click here, click there, use this button, use this feature. Too much focus on the wrong detail, explaining every single step, but then not explaining why. And not explaining the specific table values and how the organization uses the Razor's Edge. Too much focus on making it look pretty and not doing it because it takes too long. You know, in the session description, we say that writing documentation for the Razor's Edge can be like writing what? War and Peace. Is War and Peace one of those little short books? No, it's like one of those big, thick books. Okay, and that can be overwhelming. So let's switch to the positive. Let's talk about what I think you should consider doing instead. How many of you heard the expression, how do you eat an elephant? What's the answer? One bite at a time. That's kind of a gross example, actually. But, you know, it's in our phraseology, so I use it. But the idea is every process starts with a single step. And it's the same thing here. What I like to do, I'm going to show you an example here. Last week, this is literally just last week, you see it's dated October 15th. I was at the Make-A-Wish in San Francisco. And we were doing an endowment campaign there, and I needed to set up some reporting. I needed to also set up the pledge reminders. And again, I just wanted to bang through. I just wanted to go into mail and set up the pledge reminders. And then I was like, oh yeah, but I need to document it. Okay, so here's one document. It's only, what does Word say? It's only 4 pages long. We're not talking War and Peace here. We're talking about a short story. Okay, just on how pledge reminders work for the endowment campaign, as to how to run them on a monthly basis, and then how I set them up and why I set them up that way. That's the way I would suggest you consider setting up and doing your policy and procedure documentation, as small bites as you go. You're working on the newsletter. Don't consider the newsletter task done until you've documented how you generated the newsletter. Working on the special event what's it called? Save the date, thank you. You're working on the save the date for the event. What's the query criteria? How did you generate the list? How did that list get to the mail house or to do the mail merge or into the email program that you use? Don't consider that you've done the task of getting out the save the dates until you've documented it. Does that make sense? That we're not going to say, okay, give me the whole summer, and I'm going to sit down on June 1, and I'm going to write for 3 months, and at the end of the summer, then we're going to have our policy and procedure documentation done. I don't think it works very well that way. I think it's easier to do as you work on each task to document that task. So Lynn's question is it better to disseminate it as you go or to save it all up and then distribute it? I like to disseminate it as I go. And it's often the need, it's often the need that a user has that prompts me to write it, and then I give it to them right away. And I give it to them in small chunks. I don't believe in the binder. Okay, I never do 3-ring binders where let's print it all out, let's 3-hole punch it, and put it in the binder, and this is your copy of your Razor's Edge policies and procedures. I like to do one piece at a time, and I'll show you how I like to store it and disseminate it as we go in the presentation. Good question. Thank you. Make it a part of your job accountabilities and annual review. You think you're more likely to do this if you're going to get evaluated at the end of the year whether or not you did it? You know, if you're trying to lose weight, what's one of the strategies that they tell you? Tell your friends, tell your family so that they can support you in the process. You know you need to do this, but it's hard getting it done. Tell your boss. Get your boss to buy in. Say, I'd like for this to be in my annual accountabilities. Now, that'll do 2 things for you, I think. 1, I think it'll help you get it done, but 2, it'll help get your boss on board so that when you're saying, hey, I need a couple of hours to get this written, then the boss is going to understand, well, it's in her accountabilities. I need to give her the time to do it. This goes back to what we were talking about in yesterday's session for those of you that were there, is we as database administrators in the development shop, we need to be professionals. We need to act empowered. We need to be empowered to make the decisions and to do the things that are right for our organizations. Is this something that's right to do for our organization? Do I need to convince you of that, or are we bought into that? Bought in? So if this is right for our organization and we're not having the time to do it or it's not getting done, well then let's stop waiting for our bosses to tell us to do it. Let's step up and say, this is something we need to do. Now let's work together to make it happen. Does that sound fair? Paul? Great question. Can you pass these back to Paul? So that's a 2 chocolate question. So the question was, what about the other users in my office? They may know how to do these tasks better than I do. Do I have to write all of this? And I would say no, that our responsibility is, if I'm the DBA, is to see that it gets written, whether we do it or somebody else does it. So I personally do feel it's perfectly fine to coach, to train, to work with the users who are working with us on the Razor's Edge to help get that done. But as I said yesterday, the buck stops here. We're responsible for seeing that it gets done, but it's perfectly fine to work through other users. The final recommendation that I would make then is to focus on content, not format. I like pretty. I appreciate that a picture is worth 1,000 words. I like the value of all those illustrations, but they take time, and they're harder to update as Blackbaud updates the software or our policies and procedures change. So my suggestion here is not to not do it, but to be judicious about your use of screenshots and fancy formatting. Focus on content first, formatting second. Don't lose focus on the audience. As I said earlier, and although I said it briefly, you should be writing, in my view, policy and procedure documentation for people who know the Razor's Edge. Policy and procedure documentation should not be to teach the Razor's Edge. It should be how we use the Razor's Edge here at our office. Training is a separate issue. So when you're writing this is an issue I had when writing the book. When you're writing this, think of your audience. Who are you writing this for? Who's going to read this? And if you kind of get fuzzy in your mind, just pretend you're writing it for me. That again, you're going to win that $100 million lottery. You're going to leave $100,000 to your organization, and they're going to ask me to come in just to help keep things going for a few weeks until you decide you love your job so much that even though you're now a multimillionaire, you're going to come back and take the job over. But in the meantime, you need Bill to keep things going for the organization. Now, I don't mean to be immodest, but I don't need you to tell me how query works or how to add a new constituent. What I need to know is, what are your solicit codes? Why are your campaigns, funds, and appeals organized the way they are? When running the annual report, do you count gift in kinds or not? Do pledges count or do pledge payments count when running fundraising reports? That's what I need you to have figured out and left for me, not what button to click on the screen. Does that make sense? Okay. So if you kind of get lost as you're writing, think about who you're writing for and focus on a user who already knows the Razor's Edge. Lastly, there are going to be some things that I'm going to talk about in a minute that are not going to naturally come up that do need to be documented. Configuration, security, some data entry procedures that are working smoothly. So another strategy I would give you is just to say, on Mondays from 8 to 10, that's my policy and procedure time. For the most part, it's uninterruptible. Put a do not disturb sign, on the back of your chair, because most of us are in cubes, not offices. Put a big smiley on it so that you're being friendly about it, and then don't let people disturb you while you sit from Monday and 8 to 10 and write that documentation. Okay? Let's talk about another point here very quickly. So often we talk about policies and procedures in one breath that we kind of forget they're two different things. And a lot of us in this room, we're not really able to create the policy. We're not responsible for the policy. We're more responsible for the procedure. But we need the policy in order to write good procedure. So policy are those business or fundraising decisions and approaches that are not specific to the software. They're how the fundraising leadership of your operation wants things done. So the policy that says acknowledgement letters have to be out within 24 to 48 hours. Or when we do our annual report, we'll go ahead and give credit to pledgers whether or not they've paid, because we'll assume most people are going to pay their pledges. Those are policy decisions that the fundraisers need to make. You may need to help facilitate those discussions. Is that true? Okay. But those are ultimately policy decisions. The procedures then are how to do those things, how to get the acknowledgement letters out in 24 to 48 hours by going into mail and donor acknowledgement letters, and what the parameters are to make that happen, and what buttons have to be pressed in order to generate them. Or when setting up the donor category report in the reports module, exactly what are the options on the gift types tab, on the first tab around soft credit and matching gift company. Does that distinction make sense? So it may be helpful for you to understand and to think about that as you're writing this as well. Okay. I want to be clear that right now we're talking about Razor's Edge policies and procedures, but your office really should have a larger policies and procedures manual that goes well beyond your use of the Razor's Edge or eTapestry or whatever fundraising database you're using. That really this is something that you may want to go back to your office and talk to your director of development if there's no such documentation at all. But what I'm focusing on and the guidance I'm providing is specifically around the database. There's a question? So the question is there a one-to-one relationship between policy and procedure, or could there be a one-to-many? I think there could be a one-to-many, and there can be a many-to-one. I wouldn't simplify it as one-to-one. An annual report, for example, that simple report gets into a lot of things like, what do we want to call people? Do gift in kinds count? Do pledges count? Do we want to account event money or not? Do we consider those more purchases, or do we count those as donations? So I think some of these can be a lot of policies to influence one particular procedure. I won't try and throw a chocolate that far back, but I will reserve one up here for you, okay? So let's talk about what I think should be in the policies and procedures, what you should be documenting. Now, I've called this slide table of contents, but I put it in quotation marks because why? Because we're not writing a book. Okay, we're not writing one super uber manual that's going to be from soup to nuts the razor's edge. So there is no real table of contents to a single document. But this is the content that I think should be included. And this is a summary here, and then we're going to go through this more specifically in following slides. Basically, there are three areas. There's the data entry side, there's the data output side, and then there's the database setup side. So those are the three areas that I think need to be documented. Does that make sense? So let's talk about that a little bit more. So on the data entry side, I think there should be two parts to the data entry side. The first part, if you really want to do this well and have a really thorough policy and procedure documentation for the razor's edge, is you should go through a constituent record, an individual record, tab by tab, field by field, and document them. Now, last name, maybe we don't need a long description about what should go in the last name field. But solicit codes, anyone use solicit codes? Not very many hands are up. Hopefully more of you are using solicit codes in the razor's edge. Okay. What does do not call mean? Does that mean I can never, ever, 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 ever call them? What does do not mail mean? What does do not solicit mean? What constitutes a solicitation and what's not a solicitation? Is the newsletter a solicitation? When I add the newsletter as having been sent, do I add it as an appeal or do I add it as an action? Is it viewed as a solicitation tool or a cultivation tool? So then if I have a solicit code of do not solicit, does newsletter count or does it not count? That needs to be documented. Constituent codes. What's a friend? I need to know. It needs to be in your policy and procedure documentation. So don't overspend, don't get caught up in the obvious things, but going tab by tab, field by field is going to give you opportunity to discuss those kinds of fields. So here's some examples of what to think about. Who should be a constituent? Should all event people be constituents, or can you have non-constituent participants? Should all spouses be constituents, or should they not? When should an organization be added as a constituent, and when is it okay as a non-constituent business relationship? I'm assuming you all know that terminology. Okay? For each tab, list each field in the order it occurs and define your organization's unique uses and policies for that field. For each lookup field, list each table value and then explain what that table value means and how it's supposed to be used in both in both data entry and in output. Document fields made required, hidden, and renamed. How many of you used the birthplace field on the Bio 2? Okay, I think I see maybe 5 hands. That's a terrific field to rename and use for other purposes. At Junior Achievement, we renamed the religion field T-shirt size. Hope no one's offended by that. But in our religion table in the database, we had large, extra large, medium, and small because folks' religion was irrelevant to what we did at Junior Achievement. Not that religion's irrelevant. I'm a big proponent of religion. But at Junior Achievement, it was irrelevant to what we were doing as an organization. But T-shirt size was not, with all the events that we did. So those kinds of changes should be documented. Focus on special situations. For example, how does your organization define spouse? In San Francisco, that's an interesting conversation. Okay? Your organization may have a culture that defines it differently. That's actually something that you should define. When should a relationship be recorded as a spouse relationship even if they're not married, same sex or opposite sex? You should have a policy on that. What's your addressee and salutation policy about what you're going to call people? It's one of the real powerful features of the razor's edge. We don't call everybody by the same formula. So I'm called Bill Connors. even though my name's really William. I like Bill Connors, but my friend Charles is Charles. He's not Charlie, and he's definitely not Chuck. Okay, that's one of the real powers of the Razor's Edge, but you need to document as to how those defaults and exceptions should be made. Use of contact types, real powerful feature of Razor's Edge, very misunderstood, very misused. Soft credits, ugh. Okay, ugh. That's all I can say, ugh. My least favorite topic to talk about with Razor's Edge, that and United Way. Okay? I like United Way, just United Way in the Razor's Edge. All right, so you should be documenting this. But after you've done the tab by tab, field by field, we also need to think about this from a procedural standpoint. So when you add a new record, but what I don't want you to do is when you add a new constituent, it shouldn't be when you add a new constituent because we don't have constituents. We have donors, we have prospects, we have alumni, we have members, we have volunteers, and so there should be a data entry procedure for each of those record types separately because they have different fields. How to do an address change? Ugh, trying to train people on how to do address changes? Ugh, okay. Is it a home? Is it a business? Is there a new address? Is there not a new address? Do we keep the old address? What about the info source? What about the date from? Do we fill those fields out or not? What about the county? What about the region? Do we use address update software? Okay? International addresses, thank you. Okay? Not as easy as it sounds on the surface. I just love it when the director of development says, can't we just bring a temp in to do that? No. All right. Simple answer, no. Okay. I feel someone want to say amen or something. Okay. Handling marriages and divorces. There's a lot of fields. It's not just about check or uncheck the spouse box. What about gifts? What about addresses and salutations? What about actions and notes and soft credits? All right. So you get the idea. I'm not going to read the screen to you, but there's a lot of very specific things that there's not a one right way to do in the Razor's Edge. So how should it be done at your organization? Let's move on and talk about output. I think a lot of folks think of policy and procedure documentation as about how to put the data in. But if you're not sure where to start, you might actually want to start here because this is often harder to figure out if you're not there to do it, okay, is how to get the data out correctly. So let's talk about how to do that. Okay, first of all, I would suggest, if it's not clear already, that you focus on the task, not the module. It's how is the quarterly newsletter list generated to send to the mailhouse. It's how is the save the date file created to upload to NetCommunity or Constant Contact or whatever. It's not query or reports. It's the specific task that brings those modules together in the Razor's Edge in order to get the function done. Second of all, as you document each task, I would suggest you have two major parts to that. What I put at the top is how to run it now that it's set up. So donor acknowledgement letters probably, hopefully, is being run on almost a daily basis. So there's probably 4 or 5 quick steps that need to be documented. First you click on this, then you answer this question, yes or no. This is where we save them kind of stuff. But the process to set them up could go on 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 pages long. And so I like to separate those in my output documentation. If you look here at this, okay, so running monthly. So this one, it turned out to be, this mouse isn't working, turned out to be kind of long. So this is how to get the first reminders ready. So, you know, these are the buttons. It's pretty specific, blah, blah, blah. It's kind of long. But then here are the instructions for how I set them all up because someone goes in and accidentally deletes them. Or what's more common is the director of development, David, who's a great guy, is going to come to me in 6 months and say, I want these changes made. And I'm going to be like, why did I do it this way? I don't remember why I did it or where I did it. Or, oh, you know what? I used some conditional statements in my Word document, so I better press Alt F9 so I can see those conditional statements and I don't screw up the work that I already put in. So I often write policy and procedure documentation for me because I'm not going to remember what I did. It's not for somebody else, it's for me, so that I can just open up the document, go back through those steps, and then get on with it. I remember first time I did the annual report for Make-A-Wish in December of 2005. It took me 3 days to figure out how to do the annual report. 3 days full-time work to set up the annual report. Next year, 3 hours. Why? I pulled up my policy and procedure documentation, and I just followed the procedures that I had created the year before. So, and I've been there 5 years. I read the documentation more than anybody else. Well, so what should you be documenting? Mailings, all your mailings, donor acknowledgement letters, event mailings, newsletters, magazines, invitations, appeals, your reports, how your dashboards are set up, the reports that your development staff and senior management want, your annual report preparation. Okay? Should also be documenting database setup. That's not something we normally think about. How any of you have database setup documented already in your organization? Okay, good. So I see maybe 5 or 10 hands. Kudos to you. It's really something that needs to be documented as well. So configuration, let's talk about that. Are you all Razor's Edge users? Most of you at least? Okay, good. So configuration should be documented. Now tables and attributes, I find it easier to document those in the data entry documentation so they're discussed in context. So I don't just have a list of the tables and the table values and the descriptions, that the tables are discussed in the data entry side in context so I can see them and how they relate. Same with attributes. Attributes should not just exist in a vacuum. Often they do because someone had a bright idea and said, would you create this please? You know, and there's 3 entries and then it's never used again. You know what I'm talking about? Okay, I see lots of laughter, so yes. But they really should be done in context of larger procedures. But business rules, you should go through each business rule and say, this is how this is set and why. I can look in the software and see how it's set. What I care more about, what I would recommend more in your documentation is why is it set that way? On the rules about what happens when a constituent is marked as deceased, there are a lot of checkboxes there. And some of those checkboxes have pretty major implications. So why is that checkbox checked or not checked in your copy of the software? Do you really want a constituent record added and a tribute added every time someone passes away? Maybe if you're a hospice, you do, and you can explain that. Because we're a hospice and we get so many tribute gifts, we have it set up this way. If you have an exception to that and you're not a hospice but do it, you need to explain that, I would suggest. User options. User options. How many of you have even systematically set up your user options, let alone documented them? Okay, just see a few hands. So step number 1 would be to systematically think about your users' user options, and then as you think about them, document them. Security. Now this could be a big bear because there are a lot of options in security. And I'm not suggesting that you go through every single checkbox on every option in security and document it. But there should be explanations and themes as to why the groups have been set up the way they have and what kinds of users are supposed to be in those groups and what your thought was about giving this particular group the right to delete constituents. This came up yesterday in the session. So you're the DBA and you don't want to be the only one to merge duplicates. So you've given other users the rights to do that, who you trust. And so they have the ability to merge duplicates and then to delete the duplicate constituent. Well, that would be helpful to know. So again, when someone steps in your place to see why does Mary and Sally have the right to delete constituents. Any questions about that? Does that make sense? Okay. I would also suggest documenting your database maintenance. What are those tasks that need to be done on a regular basis to keep your database running healthy and happily? So what are they? When do they need to be run? Why do they need to be run? I like to do this in an Excel spreadsheet. If you'd like a template for this, email me after the session and I'll send you an Excel template that you can use to adopt for your organization. And then as the tasks are done, put in my name or initials and the date it was done, just so that I can assure it was done. This has worked really effectively for us at Make-A-Wish because I still work with Make-A-Wish, but there's also a full-time database administrator there. And so we can stay in sync with each other. So he goes on vacation, I know what I need to step in and do in his absence. He has a log remembering what he's done. Be certain to address processes about how you make sure your backups and system maintenance are successfully running as well. When's the last time you went into the Blackbaud Management Console and made sure the backup and the system maintenance so that they were successfully completed? Last week? Last month? Past 6 months? True story, Make-A-Wish, about 4 weeks ago, we went in one day. Dan, who's the DBA, Monday morning, his first task is to log into the BMC. Backup hadn't run for 3 days. Nothing happened that we know of. He just happened to do his weekly check, and the backup had stopped running in the BMC. No backups for 3 days. 3 days? Not a big deal. 3 months? 3 quarters? 3 years? Sometimes the BMC just stops making backups. When's the last time you checked? I'll leave it at that. Some other tips. When you create this documentation, I would suggest you put your name on it, or as Paul asked, someone else writes it, put their name on it and the date that they did it. And that's both for the creation date and the update date. We want to know who the source is. But by and large, as you reference positions and roles, use titles, use position names, not people's names. It's not every Monday Mary should do this. It's every Monday the development assistant does this. Or it's not every Monday Sally logs in to the BMC to check to see if it's been run. It's the database administrator or someone from IT, and you name the position in IT. But as you are explaining the why and the wherefore in the documentation, I would say who the source was. So Patricia is the executive director at Make-A-Wish. When she sends me an email that says, I want this in the annual report, I copy the email and I paste it into the policy and procedure documentation. There is the authoritative source, name, date, and almost serial number as to why this is set up the way it's set up. Not really pretty to have those emails pasted in, but boy is it effective to say who said it, when, and why. Each section should address not only not only what, but also why. Please don't forget to explain why. And also sometimes, why not? Well, we thought about doing it this way because this seemed to make more sense, but we ran into this roadblock or this part that didn't work. I wanted to use quick letters because that's the best place to create the file for the mailhouse. But we needed this field, and we needed this field for this reason, and quick letters wouldn't provide that. So that's why we're doing this in export, even though we know we're supposed to use quick letters rather than export. Okay, I like to make the document complete. I don't like saving emails in my Outlook or hard copies in a file. I copy and paste till this document may be a monster Word document, but it is the one repository of information about this process. Okay, and again, just in case there's any question, we're not talking here about one Word document. We're talking about numerous specifically focused Word documents. Make sense? Okay. So I think, Alin, you asked about distribution of this. What we do at Make-A-Wish is we have the Razor's Edge folder on the G drive, the shared drive that all users can access. And we have a folder for each related topic that we deal with. So events, direct mail, reporting, the program area. We manage all of the Wish children, all the Wish volunteers in Razor's Edge, crystal reporting, auction tracker, which we use for auctions. And then within those, we have more specific folders. So we have a big direct mail program. We do acquisition direct mail. We do what we call special mail. We have a renewal program, kind of like a membership program through through direct mail, and each of those processes is different, so I have a folder separate for each, and then within those are the Word documents. This is the way I would recommend storing and disseminating the information. Everybody on the entire staff has access to this folder. Not only Dan and I have read and add and delete and edit rights, but everybody in the organization can read these. And the way we distribute documentation is I don't attach the Word document to the email and send it out. I do an email with a link, and that link points them back to the folder here. And I encourage my users generally not to print this out, because what are we doing? We're updating it as things change. So the minute you print it, it's out of date. And so I'd rather them store the links than to come to here and to open the document to see it, to see what's the latest procedure on address changes or constituent entry or reporting, than to them to have binders and folders of hard copies. That's the way we prefer to do it. Okay? Any questions? Yes? Right? The question is, I said I'd be willing to send the email spreadsheet for the maintenance log. What's my email address? We'll get to that on the last slide. Thank you. Yes, please.
Typically, you might recommend a policy, but you're not necessarily the final decision maker.
Right.
Do you recommend that there be some type of committee that needs to review policies and sort of give it a final blessing?
So the question is, do I recommend that there be a committee that reviews policies and approves them, blesses them before they go into effect? My quick answer to that, because it's a good question, but it's a complicated question. My quick answer would be it really probably depends on the size and sophistication of the organization. There's no question at Make-A-Wish, Patricia makes the decision. And not that she's, a tyrant. I'm not implying that. Patricia, you're wonderful if you happen to be watching. She's a really good executive director. I think the world of her. If more executive directors believed in technology and fundraising like Patricia did, we'd be a lot better off. But she's basically the decision maker. We know that it's not an issue. I ask Patricia, she says, we run with it. Universities, colleges, large hospital foundations, and so forth, it may be a more complicated decision-making process, and in that case, then you may need a committee. So I just think it depends on how hard it is to get someone to make that decision and how controversial it might be. Yes? So the question is, and it's an excellent question, another 2 chocolate question here, if you could pass those back please, is where to start. If you have nothing and you had to get started, where would you start? I would do 2 things. The first thing I would do is I would block off the time on the calendar so that you have that time set aside. Okay. The second thing that I would do is I would start with your next output process, just whatever it happens to be. If it's now October, and it's time to get ready for the direct mail file for the end of year appeal. And so that's what you're going to go back and do next week. I would start with that. Okay, so you've got to write the query. I would sit down, write the query, and then I would go to Word and I would document in Word what you just did in the query and why. You're merging queries, so you have to write an exclude query, a second query. I would write the exclude query and I would turn to the Word document and I would write it down. I would merge them. I would go to the documentation and explain that you merged them. And I would just kind of do that back and forth. I would start with whatever is next on your agenda, because that's the easy way to do it. The point is to establish the habit that the task is not done until it's documented. And so start with the next task, whatever it may be. All right, thank you. All right, so let me give you a couple of Word tips as we wrap up here. This is not a Word class, so I can't go through a lot of this, but I would recommend and like to use the headings feature in Word. That's what, where's the mouse? Okay, that's what these things are over here. And it's really helpful for consistent formatting and if you need to create a table of contents for Word to help you create the table of contents. So this is Word 2007. So the reason this is formatted the way it is looks like this is a different version here, that I can click on heading 1. Okay, and now that's going to be formatted. It didn't change because it was already formatted that way. But that's now the topmost level. This is formatted the way it is, not because I applied italics in that font and that size, but because, in essence, I clicked on heading 2. Okay, so I like that feature a lot when creating my documentation. The document map is a nice feature as your documents get long. If you go to the View menu and click on Document Map, you now have an outline on the left side of your screen of your document. How does it know what to put in the outline? What we just talked about, the headings. That's another advantage of using the headings feature. Page numbers, don't forget to add them. I assume most of you know how to add page numbers. Control K. If you press Control K, whoops, wrong button, in Word, you can create hyperlinks. You can create hyperlinks to other portions within the same document, as well as hyperlinks to other documents. What you're going to find as you start creating this is there's a lot of back and forth. Well, we're doing it this way here in this procedure because this other procedure requires it. And so this allows you to create cross-references and hyperlinks. I like to use the highlighter. I gave you some examples earlier. What I like to do is anything that has to be updated every time I do it, I highlight it with yellow. So that stands out that the next time I run the newsletters, be sure and update those fields. Again, limit the use of screenshots, but the judicious use of screenshots can be very helpful. Alt print screen allows you to do screenshots to paste into your document if you didn't know that. Cropping can be helpful. That's a little bit more than we have time to show you, but you might want to look it up, Google it, or look in the word help for that. And then the drawing toolbar. Whoops. Okay, some final challenges. Information that goes in two places, attributes and tables. I would suggest putting that in the data entry side. There is some chicken and egg that can go on. Which comes first? Do I figure out the entry or do I figure out the output? Because the entry should be driven by the output. So that's just a challenge. I'll make you aware there's no magic answer. You just jump in and do your best. And then how to get started? Just go do it. Okay? So how are we doing on time? Couple minutes. So we'll take one or two questions. You asked for my email address. There's my email address. Be happy to send you. Again, I talk about this more in the book if you're interested. Not trying to plug it or anything, but just to let you know it is talked about there. If you don't want to buy the book but you want more information, just email me. I'll email you the chapter. It's really about helping you. I'm not trying to sell the book. Lynn?
Good question. Process flows. Aren't organizations leading process flows saying, this kid follows this, and within that we put those policy procedures.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about process flows, or should that be its own separate document?
The question is about process flows and what I think about process flows. I think they're great if you have the time and sophistication to do it. Especially if you can get into Visio and diagrams. I mean, all of that's wonderful, but that's another opportunity to make this more complicated and take longer and not get it done. I'd rather just do a simple Word document with the basics and get it done than to get overly sophisticated and not get done. One more question and we'll call it a session. Mary Jo?
We're into Financial Edge.
Okay.
So there's loads of this. It's certainly applicable.
Sure.
Is there a book that is a mirror image of this for Financial Edge?
The last question is that she's using Financial Edge. Is there something comparable to this, the Financial Edge? And my answer, to my knowledge, no. All right, thank you all very much. Have a great conference. And thank you those that were online. Have a good day.